Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Speak Plainly podcast, where we speak plainly about things that matter. I'm your host, Owl Medicine, and I know I have been gone for a little while. I normally put out a podcast every week, and for those of you who follow, you've probably noticed I have been gone for a month. Now, that's very unusual for me, and although I find it very important to keep my promises and to keep putting out things like this podcast, I made a very good adult decision for myself about this. And I decided that this was the perfect chance for a bit of a format switch and to catch you guys up on a few things. The reason that I haven't been able to do a podcast this last month is because my dog, my best friend in the world, got a terminal cancer diagnosis. And multiple times throughout this last month, she was unable to stand, unable to walk, just really weak. And a couple of times I called the home euthanasia people to see what their availability was because things had gone south. And although you've heard me talk about the importance of picking a date and sticking to it and deadlines and the importance of the self-worth and the self-respect that comes from sticking to your word, one of the fundamental operating procedures I have is that our quality of life is determined nearly exclusively by the quality of our relationships. My relationship with Key has been the most important relationship in my entire adult life. She's been there for me for 12 years. She knew me when I was a staff sergeant in the military, and she was with me when we were homeless on the streets. This dog slept under bridges and behind bushes. She's hopped freight trains, been to 44 states and 2 countries multiple times. Her and I have done a lot together, and she is my best friend, and there is nothing more important to me than her. And that's why I've been absent. So I apologize for my absence. I apologize for not being able to hang out with you guys in the way that I normally have. But I thank you for your patience because this is important to me. My relationships are important to me, and I hope that you too will not put productivity in front of your relationships, even if that relationship is a dog. For me, Key is number one. She's my number one baby, so I stayed to take care of her. All right. Well, now you know I've been missing for a month, and you can probably guess what today's topic is now. Today's topic is cancer and the treatment of cancer using herbs, and specifically Chinese herbs, because that's what I know. So when this happened, and there was a whole mess about, we couldn't figure out what was going on at first, but eventually once we got the cancer diagnosis, the first thing that happens for everybody who's remotely medically inclined is a frantic Googling. And I'm no different. I definitely had my frantic Googling, and I Googled like nearly every combination of words of herbs, cancer, treatment of cancer, Chinese medicine and herbs, treatment of and management of cancer using herbs and plant-derived compounds, cancer, plant-derived compounds, cancer science management, all kinds of stuff. So, and as you can, I'm sure, guess, I got bombarded with tons and tons and tons and tons of stuff. Now, because it's typically like the average person who's Googling these types of things, the first thing that you run into are a bunch of articles written by professional freelance writers that kind of summarize different either systematic reviews or meta-analyses or a specific study or two. But it's still being written by somebody who at the end of the article has a blip about the reason they write is because they love their cat. And that's not exactly the type of science I was trying to find, although I read enough of those to just try to hopefully find good meta-analyses, because like you can go to PubMed and type this stuff in and it can kind of take a while. But that's where I started. So I eventually used those to narrow down what good articles, what good scientific articles I could find. And I spent hours and hours and hours every day digging into this stuff. And it got really difficult because most of the time I couldn't dive in the way that I really wanted to dive in because Key was really sick. She was really weak. So I had a hard time being able to pay attention to her. And I mean, for a week, I couldn't let her sneeze because whenever she sneezed, the tumor in her mouth would just bleed profusely. And she bled so much that she wound up really severely anemic. So severely anemic that we've been told twice that she needs an emergency blood transfusion in the next 5 days. But luckily, the Chinese herbs have prevented that from actually having to happen, which is also great because I don't have $2,500 to just spend on a blood transfusion. But all of that research and reading obviously takes a lot of time, and time was not my friend because I'm trying to do the research. I'm trying to find what herbs that I can use, what they're for. And as I move through this topic, I'm just looking for what herbs do what against cancer, right? So I'm finding information, and I'm looking at in vivo and in vitro studies. And I start to really pay attention to the details of this. And I find that there's tons of science about individual plant-derived compounds and their actions on cancer in petri dishes mostly, and sometimes in animals. And the petri dishes are in vitro, and in animals are the in vivo studies. So if you see that in vivo or in vitro, that's the difference. The problem with the in vitro studies specifically is my train of thought looking at this was like, okay, herbs have active compounds in them, and the active compounds in those herbs have an effect on cancer cells and on healthy cells. So let's put them in a petri dish with cancer cells and like healthy cells and see what happens. That's what the science did, right? And so I thought that was good. I thought that was fine. Well, the problem, as I did more and more research on this, and I'm spending a bunch of money on extracts over the counter, and as well as buying like the Chinese herbs. But a lot of this stuff is available over the counter. So you can run and you can buy like berberine or curcumin, which are plant-derived compounds that get pulled from different herbs. Like curcumin that's the active compound in turmeric. Berberine's found in a couple of things like Oregon grape and a few other really tanniny plants. But the problem, I didn't know at first. I went and bought some berberine. I didn't know that berberine has an abysmal bioavailability. So if you eat 1,000 milligrams of berberine, less than 1 milligram is actually going to get absorbed into your body because it's got a less than 1% bioavailability. So like taking an over-the-counter berberine supplement isn't nearly as helpful as I thought it was going to be. And I didn't know that until a week into my research, because the research had been so interrupted by life, by bleeding from the tumor, by Key's weakness, by having to let her out and just watching her so closely and so carefully. That's a really important piece to understand, is when you're looking at these studies on what these different herbs do in cancer, the science is done in a way that just isn't useful in a lot of cases, because not only is bioavailability a major issue, they're looking at single compounds in a plant that has hundreds to thousands of individual compounds in it that all may have an effect. And what they'll do is they'll break down an herb to its individual compounds and try to figure out which ones are most active and then study that one. The issue is, what we're finding, especially with science coming out of China, is that it's not about what one compound can do. It's about the synergy of compounds. And we'll get into synergy when we get into the Chinese medicine way of treating cancer a little bit later. This is all part of why the management of cancer and the treatment of cancer using over-the-counter supplements and herbs and all of that has the rap that it does, is because the science that's there is just so many steps removed from being anywhere near useful that it's easy to just laugh it all off and dismiss it because of the way that we do science in the Western world. It's purely reductionistic. We look at one big thing and we break it down into its smallest parts, and then we study each tiny part in isolation, which is great if it's mechanical. But if these things are chemical, like the things in our body are, then there's so much happening synergistically that we cannot possibly begin to comprehend what's happening in a person or even in an animal from what we find happening in a petri dish with one plant compound and one cancer cell. Now, there's lots of reasons for that. One of the reasons for that is because cancer cells don't just grow tumors. Cancer cells actually recruit other healthy cells to do a bunch of stuff for them. And so inside every tumor is actually a bunch of non-tumor cells. And those non-tumor cells are undifferentiated. So they're also not really human cells. They're not, or in my case, dog cells. But they're not helping the host. They're just taking food for the purpose of replicating. So studying a single compound in a petri dish with just cancer cells is pointless because that's not what happens in real life. And I could go on and on and on about my frustrations with the science behind this, but ultimately science is like Western science is doing what it can. I was really frustrated and was dreaming and just wishing that somebody would take a look at whole herb prescriptions, like not just one herb, but an actual prescription, like one of the old traditional formulas of Chinese medicine, like Tong, which actually has been studied. But a lot of this information is coming out of China, and the publications are only in Chinese, and but the meta-analyses have been done in English. Thank goodness. Thank goodness for these people. But there's some studies coming out of China that do look at the entire herbal formula, which is super awesome. One of them actually mapped the herbal formula from the 5 individual herbs in the formula to all of their active compounds, and then traced all of those active compounds to the known pathways of disruption in metabolic syndrome. So this was really cool. The formula was originally of a Chinese formula that's most commonly known for as formula for schizophrenia. Yet it has a huge effect on metabolic syndrome. There was a study out of China that did a review of all of those, and that was amazing to see how well it worked, for one, but then to see how they actually quantified the synergy of all of these active compounds and how they all work together to have an effect on the previously already established known pathways of disruption in metabolic syndrome. I just thought that was really, really cool, and that's the kind of science that we need. We don't need these one-to-one isolated incident studies. They're just not informative. They are ineffective, inefficient, a waste of time and money when it comes to trying to solve the issue of cancer. So as I learned all of this stuff, Key would roller coaster. She was going up and going down, and we eventually got her in for chemo. And I was really worried about chemo because I have been a big advocate of doing as much as you can, as naturally as you can, very well, kind of my whole life. I didn't know that chemotherapy for pets is very different than it is for chemotherapy for humans. Chemotherapy for humans is all about extending our life because we want more of life. And in pets, it's all about improving their quality of life. Their lifespans are already so short that in general, any oncologist, veterinary oncologist, is going to focus on making sure that your beloved animal is well taken care of and will get whatever chemo or radiation that they can give them up into a point where once their quality of life starts to suffer, that's the end of that. They're not trying to make people suffer in order to cure anything. They just treat all chemo and radiotherapy as palliative for the most part. That's another really important thing to know if you were dealing with a pet and getting a cancer diagnosis like I did. I also didn't know that that's basically what this whole podcast for the next hour or so is just going to be me telling you all the things I didn't know about cancer and Chinese medicine and the management of cancer and the management of chemo side effects with Chinese medicine. So I also didn't know, I knew that Chinese medicine and Chinese herbs were really good at being an adjunctive therapy or a supportive therapy during chemo and radiation. And you learn a few things about that in acupuncture school, but in Chinese medicine school, they literally make you say out loud, "I do not treat cancer." We had a whole class about how you never get to say that you treat cancer. You treat people, you can treat the side effects of cancer, but it was a whole big scare tactic thing. It was you don't treat cancer. So we got that understood in TCM school. However, I didn't know that there has been a bunch of science now about specific herbs and even a few herb formulas and their chemoprotective or chemosensitization effects. I didn't know that Dongui and Huangqi, which is Angelica sinensis root is Dongui and Huangqi is astragalus root. I didn't know that both of those have a really profound effect on platinum-based chemotherapy drugs. They not only sensitize the cancer to the effects of the chemotherapy, they simultaneously protect healthy cells from the effects of the chemotherapy, which is fantastic because Western medicine is incredible. Western medicine is just better at some things, and Eastern medicine is just better at other things. And what Western medicine is amazing at are crises. If you have a serious life or death crisis, the more of a crisis, the better. That's where Western medicine thrives. If you need open heart surgery or a brain drain or something really, really complicated and life-threatening, I don't care. I'm not going to give you a leaf to chew on. I don't care what leaf somebody else does give you to chew on. You need to take your ass to the ER. You need to find somebody who was qualified to do what needs to be done to save your life. However, the tools of Western medicine are extremely limited. And because of that, there are issues in the way that they treat cancer. In Western medicine, we've treated cancer the same way that we've always treated cancer, even before the invention of biomedicine. The principles are the same. You either cut it, burn it, or poison it. You are legally only allowed to treat cancer in the United States with chemotherapy, surgery, and radiation. So if anybody with a medical license of any sort says that they treat cancer, they will lose that license because you're legally only allowed to treat cancer in these three ways in the United States. Most of that's because there have been trillions poured into cancer research since the official announcement of the war on cancer from the early 70s. So there is an ass load of money that is thrown at and is being made on cancer research and prevention, and any form of treatment that is not patentable threatens the pocket lining of the most powerful people in the world, and they don't like that. And unfortunately for them anyway, fortunately for us, unfortunately for them, they can't copyright, they can't patent an already existing naturally occurring compound. And that's what's happening with all of the herbs. They can't patent those things because they show up naturally. Whereas all of the drugs in the world, they make from petrochemicals or the waste products from oil refining. So those they get to buy for dirt cheap and then patent and charge as much as they want, because it's literally waste. It's literally garbage that they then turn into incredible medications. My issue with Western medicine's treatments of cancer and what's happening with the Western medicine and the specifically like the National Cancer Institute. Like the National Cancer Institute in 2012 requested more than $2 billion for basic research into the mechanism and causes of cancer. Another $1.3 billion is requested for treatment and cancer prevention and control. Gets $232 million altogether. Now that's pretty fucked, because admittedly on the National Cancer Institute's website, almost all of the advancements in cancer have been made in the prevention and control category. Yet they get almost nothing. They get way less than the curative stuff and the treatment stuff. We are obsessed with finding a cure for cancer when preventing cancer is where all the advancements have been made, but there's no money to be made in prevention unless it's a prophylactic drug. Now, the main ways that Western medicine are focusing on trying to cure cancer is they're looking at checkpoint inhibitors, and the checkpoints are checkpoints at basically each of the cancer's metabolic processes, and we'll cover those in a little bit. They're also looking at immune system modulators. They're looking at monoclonal antibodies. They're looking at how to reduce side effects. And they're also looking to possibly cure cancer using T-cell transfer therapies. And that's all really cool. Each one of those things are all patentable and can be price gouged at any moment in time. The way America has handled cancer is shameful. Like in most things, we show a good face. But if you go to the official National Cancer Institute's website, you will see lots of proclamations about the advancements, all of which are true, but it's spun in just the right way to make you believe that like the survivability for cancer patients is way better than it used to be, and that's just not the case. The information about the advancements is coming from early testing and prevention, but that's okay. I've bashed it long enough because, like I said, they are better at certain things. You know, they're better at that crisis stuff. And when it comes to stage 3 and stage 4 cancers, an integrative approach is definitely the best approach. I've had the privilege of having a book given to me a while back on the treatment of cancer with Chinese medicine and herbs. And it's a book from a Chinese guy who had 45 years of oncology experience as a doctor, a Chinese medicine doctor, treating just cancer patients. And it's really, really cool because as I was going through and looking at this and talking to my friends about it, we at first, the conversation was about how different the Western and Eastern medicine approach is because the Western approach is, well, like I said, it's burn, cut, or poison. And that seems really extreme. And looking from the outside in, especially as a person who may be like burnt out from Western medicine or has given up on it, Western medicine left a bad taste in their mouth for one reason or another. It's easy to say that they're nothing alike, that Western medicine and Eastern medicine are nothing alike in their treatments because Eastern medicine is using these natural compounds and not these highly toxic substances. And that's true to a degree. Because, like I said, the tools are the main difference between the Western and the Eastern approach. The tools of Western medicine, all they have is that chemo, radiation, and surgery. All they do is attack the disease because they don't treat people, they treat diseases. So they attack the disease and there's no support for the person. And that's where Eastern medicine is completely different, is Eastern medicine focuses primarily on support for the person and also attacking the cancer. But it depends on which stage you're at in this process. But if you're early on, then especially precancerous lesions, the Chinese approach is to strengthen the body so it can, on its own, reverse whatever mutation caused the precancerous lesions, and it resolves itself. All the way up to once you get into stage 3 and stage 4, you get into stage 3 and you have a tumor now, but that tumor needs to be attacked. And Chinese medicine also uses poison. They use actual poisons. When you look at what was traditionally used, they used things like mercury, and oh, that sounds awful. Guess what? That's what allopathic medicine used for ages. And also, guess what? All of like mercury, arsenic, all of these heavy platinum, all of these titanium and bismuth. There's so many metals. These things are extremely toxic to humans, heavy metals and stuff. And that is exactly what chemotherapy is based on. The chemotherapy drug that my dog was on, cisplatin, carboplatin, but cisplatin and carboplatin are both platinum-based chemotherapy drugs, which worked out great because she was on Dongui Bushui Tong, which is just a combination of the Huang Qi and the Dongui I was talking about earlier. And those have a fantastic protective chemo effect, and she was severely anemic from the blood loss. So it was a perfect formula to give her to work simultaneously with the chemotherapy, because at the time when we got the chemo, the tumor was really quickly growing. It was really quickly growing. Like in a month, it had quadrupled or more in size. So we were getting really worried, and it froze that because it was growing so fast. All of the chemo went straight to the tumor itself. And the Dongui Bushui Tong allowed the sensitization of that tumor as well as the protective effects on the healthy cells. But that got to happen because I found some science about the combination therapies. And this is the kind of stuff that you only do in stage 3 and 4, is where you're working on supporting the person while they're going through chemotherapy. And this is what I would like to say very plainly is, for me, from what I can tell in my research, early stuff, precancerous lesions like stage 1 and 2 are able to be mediated by herbal compounds and lifestyle changes and that sort of thing for the most part. But once you get into stage 3 and 4, you need the heavy guns. And America loves the heavy guns. We really love our heavy guns, and our medical establishment is no different. And there's a good reason for that. So here it works well because they do have these heavy toxins, and the unfortunate part of chemo and radiation is one of the cells in the body that multiplies almost as fast as cancer is bone marrow. And bone marrow is extremely important for our life and for our health and our experience, our subjective experience of quality of life. Without healthy bone marrow, we're going to be miserable. And bone marrow, because it multiplies fast, is also affected negatively by the chemotherapy. Now, after chemotherapy happens, there is a natural rebounding in the body's ability to produce those red blood cells. But there might be mutations and there might be changes because that was a lot of poison. So that I found very interesting because the very first chemo drugs were actually from mustard gas. During the 1930s, they realized that mustard gas, which they were exposed to in war, had long-term negative effects on the bone marrow of the people who got gassed. And they went, They were also studying cancer at the time, and they went, oh, that's interesting. Bone marrow cells replicate really quickly, and cancer cells replicate really quickly. And over the course of like 14 years, they went from injecting the first person with mustard gas to being able to come up with the first semi-successful chemotherapeutic drugs based on mustard gas. I also found that very interesting. So I mentioned synergy before. Now I'm going to switch over to, I know I've been going back and forth, but that's the way my mind works, and that's the way I kind of experienced this whole process. I'm trying my best to create a somewhat easily followable narrative so you can pick up the new information and learn the new things that I learned in a kind of systematic way that also follows the story of my experience of this. Partially because the story of the experience of it is just easier to talk about than trying to turn this into some kind of like online course or something, which is what it kind of has felt like because there's so much involved. But with the treatment of cancer in Chinese medicine, in China, or at least in Chinese medicine, the philosophy is that there are 4 ways that a person can get cancer. Each one leads to a slightly different type of cancer, and they're like repressed emotions, and it's like anything that injures the spleen and environment and toxins, that sort of thing, and old age, overexertion, that sort of thing, just getting old and tired. Those are the 4 ways that you get cancer. There's 2 types of cancer tumors, at least in Chinese medicine, and these are as old as the Neijing, chapter 22 of the Neijing, which is a few thousand years old, which the Neijing, for people who aren't acupuncturists, is one of the original texts of acupuncture that kind of laid the foundation. And in the Neijing, they're called Jiju, and the Jiju are the yin and yang versions of tumors, and some are hard and don't move, and some are softer and have a tendency to move. And you treat them slightly differently. The prognosis is different for each, but I only bring this up to say that in China, they have at least a 3,000-year-old concept of cancer and tumors. Furthermore, in studying these individual compounds, one of the things that you realize quickly in the science of these things is the difference between a therapeutic dose of a plant-derived compound that would be used in the treatment of cancer and a poisonous dose is very, very small. So once you start getting to a level of like, this could be functional, a level of curcumin or a level of berberin or a level of any of the other like plant-based alkaloids, once you get to a therapeutic level, you're pretty much going to poison the patient. And if you get just 2 of those, you're definitely going to poison the patient. And if you keep adding enough of this stuff, you're going to create issues, right? And so this is where synergy becomes a very, 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 very important piece in the Chinese medicine approach. Is it's not about the one active compound doing something in the body. Cancer is a extremely, extremely intelligent disease. In fact, one study actually had a tumor where the guy implanted tumors of 2 different colors on a rat. and then the next day checked the tumor cells again, and one was red, one was blue, and they were planted on opposite sides of the body, and the next day, literally 1 day later, both of those tumor cells were purple. Because even in different places, two different tumors still coordinate in the body. They can still communicate. So cancer is extremely complicated and nuanced, which is why those in vitro studies are just bloody useless. So the concept with the synergy in herbal compounds is that by doing a formula that combines multiple Chinese herbs, and in Chinese herbs we have these concepts of like dui yao pairs, or these two herbs that together have a stronger effect than they would if either of them were given individually. That's the concept that we're talking about. It's not just dui yao pairs, but these formulas are thousands of years old, and these herbs work really well together. And what we find is that by focusing on the synergy between herbs, we are able to keep the dose really low for the herbs, but have the effect of those herbs far outreach what the larger doses of less herbs would be. That's super helpful. All right. Now, as I was doing this research, I found that there are 7 basic phases in the life cycle of cancer. And so the synergy ties really, really well with this concept of redundancy. And this is the perfect place to talk about it. There are 7 phases in the life cycle of cancer. Number 1 is the uncontrolled proliferation of cells. 2 is abnormal differentiation. 3 is loss of apoptosis. Apoptosis is just cell death. 4, loss of contact inhibition. That's the invasion. 5 is loss of cohesiveness or adhesiveness. That's the metastasis. 6 is immune suppression. And 7 is the tumor markers are overexpressed, called antigens on the cell surface, and that makes them different from normal healthy cells. So each of these 7 phases are basically areas that we can sneak in. Like each one of those 7 things are things that we can work on to be like, fuck you, cancer. Because there's not one way to fight cancer. We've already covered. It's very, very difficult to fight. It's very difficult to fight because it is a mutating badass. It really is. I knew that cancer cells were mutated human cells. I didn't realize how mutated they are and how much that mutation lends itself to what they do. So they're mutated human cells, right? But I didn't realize that those mutations create really small changes that allow for almost like what are those impossible machines? Like you would have some kind of engine that turns some other engine that moves a thing that then turns your original engine, and it's like perpetual motion device. That's what I'm thinking of. Cancer is basically mutating the cells around it to kind of be a perpetual motion device. And the perpetual motion in this case is the uncontrolled proliferation of cells. And having all 7 of these steps in the cancer life cycle, we can act on each one of these mechanisms. And the joy of the science that is out there is they have traced a lot of these individual compounds to some aspect of these 7 phases, either to apoptosis or differentiation or proliferation or preventing metastasis or preventing invasion. We now have correlations, thanks to science, on which compounds and which herbs are effective on which steps of that cancer's life cycle. And that's fantastic because most herbs, as I mentioned, are not limited to one compound. They have tons of compounds in them. And if the whole herb is studied, you'll often find that a whole herb covers 3, 4, maybe even 5 of these phases in the cancer's life cycle. So by using herbal formulas that have multiple herbs, what we're doing is we're getting redundancies in our interventions at each step of this cycle. That's super cool. Any healthy ecosystem needs biodiversity, especially because of how much cancer cells can mutate and do mutate. And that's why we wind up with things like chemo-resistant cancer, is because the chemo will actually manipulate itself to protect itself from chemotherapy, from whatever type of chemotherapy that you were originally given. It does that because it's so easily able to mutate to go, oh, you found a chink in my armor. I'm gonna pop up some new armor right there. So by using lots and lots of herbs that have lots and lots of compounds in them, we get redundancies at each steps in the cancer's life cycle. So we can have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different herbs that are all acting on preventing metastasis, or preventing immune suppression, or preventing invasion, or mitosis, or differentiation. That's super important, because if there's a bunch of ways that are all intervening, the cancer can't adapt to each of them, right? It can't change to adapt to 7 different ways of preventing invasion. So if we're attacking the invasion aspect specifically, if we're looking at that and we have an herbal formula with 12 different herbs on it, and 8 of them, it seems, have something to do with preventing invasion on there, that cancer cell can't change to accommodate all 8. It might be able to successfully adapt to 1 or 2, maybe even 3 of them. But we have 8 different compounds that are all acting on preventing invasion, say, or 8 different compounds all acting on preventing metastasis, or preventing new blood vessels, angiogenesis. Okay, so here's how I've framed what I'm doing with Ki. I have multiple formulas going. And now that we're in chemo, I'm about to do more chemo stuff, I have let off of the toxic formula, but the primary focus are supporting the patient, right? Supporting Ki. So like right now I've got her on a very strong blood and chi building formula. And that's one of the basic formulas that you need to keep your people on and your pets on. You got to have something to support their constitution, to make sure that they're making new blood and doing all of that stuff. That has been extremely, extremely, extremely important. It's been so important that on nights that I have gone to bed without giving Ki her night herbs, the next day it's very, very obvious that I did not give her herbs. So supporting the Constitution is extremely important. You need a formula for supporting the Constitution. You also need a formula for the toxicity. In Chinese medicine, they would normally have a toxic formula whose specific job is to go after the toxins in the body, because from a Chinese medicine perspective, there are toxins whose job is to target other toxins. And those come from like the Mylobris beetle, the bufo toad secretions. Those are the traditional herbs by Hua Shishitsao. Those are traditional herbs that, well, the Bai Hua Shishitsao is not that one. Yeah. But those are traditional herbs that are toxic, that help target the tumor itself and help destroy the tumor. And those you give in from a Chinese medicine perspective, like separate from any Western treatment. This would take the place of the chemo and the radiation. So I told you that although it seems things are really different because of the tools being so different, and in Western medicine, they just hook you up to an IV and watch you lose all your hair and you feel like shit and like wish that you were dead. during chemo because there's no support for you as a person. Chinese medicine supports the patient profoundly because it is our perspective that cancer comes from a buildup of toxins. And not all toxins build up to be cancer toxins, but under certain conditions, they will. And once the cancer toxin has gotten strong enough, there's also anti-cancer chi in the body. And once the anti-cancer chi has become weak due to the strength of the cancer toxin, that's when the cancer starts showing up. So by stimulating the inherent immune system of the patient, you're fighting the tumor really well, as best as you can early on, because hopefully it's not that aggressive yet. And the equivalent to the chemo and radiation was using toxic herbs, either topically on the tumor itself, if the tumor is visible, to get it to blister and fester and get forced out by the body as being now recognized as a foreign, toxic, invading bad thing. That's what they have in common, is they still treat fire with fire. That really is the same. And that's another thing I found really cool about this, is that it's really not that different in philosophy. As far as you have a toxin, you have a crazy toxin that's trying to kill you, and the only way to kill it is to be more toxic than it is, and hopefully do that selectively to just it. So you'll have a toxic formula, you'll have a support formula, and then hopefully, if you're smart, you're going to have a bit of a digestion formula. You're going to have something to aid your digestion. And I don't care how you do this, right? Like, it's not, and none of this, I should have said this at the beginning, none of this counts as medical advice. If you have cancer, or anyone that you know has cancer, go find somebody who is like licensed and like legally does all of these things. This is just educational and entertainment purposes. So if you do find yourself in this kind of situation and you find yourself Googling all kinds of stuff about cancer and anti-cancer activities, and you're trying to get someone or something that you love on some anti-cancer stuff, be aware that there's a lot of things that you need to take into account, like the bioavailability of it, the therapeutic dosages of these things, whether those studies were done in vivo or in vitro make a huge difference. And also find out what kind of cancer you're dealing with as fast as you can, because certain cancers react differently to certain things. One of the things I found that was extremely important in all of this, I had heard, but I wasn't sure, so I re-Googled it. Cancer cannot use ketones to grow. At the very least, not very well, but it seems like they just can't really use them. It uses glucose. And so that means that one of the best things that you can do is not eat glucose. So don't have sugars. Don't eat things that turn into sugar super easily. So avoid your carbs and starches, especially the simple ones. But if you don't know what kind of cancer you have, you're kind of screwed, because what works on a sarcoma might not work on a melanoma, which might not work on an adenocarcinoma. So that whole, like, one of the primary things I was like, okay, this is great. I can use this. I haven't fed Key any carbs since her diagnosis because I found this out. But then I was worried for a little while because of the location of the mass on Key. We had a pretty good chance of it being a melanoma, because in the nose and mouth in dogs, it's pretty common that it's a melanoma. Well, it also turns out that 50% of melanomas have a mutated gene that allows them to create glucose from a untraditional way. So they still can they don't really use the ketones, but they can still create their own glucose for themselves. So a ketogenic diet may not be as useful in that situation, or maybe it is. I don't know. But those are the kinds of things that you really have to pay attention to and have to think about. Because as you're moving through this, it was really easy for me to get lost and to focus too much on trying to figure out what type of cancer it was. From a Western medicine perspective, you can get a biopsy and then mail off the biopsy, and somebody looks at it under a microscope who knows things like that, and they send you back an email and tell you what they think it is according to what they know. And from a Chinese medicine perspective, you can't do that. So there are other markers for like, what does the tumor look like, or where is it at and how does it feel? Is it slow growing? Is it fast growing? Does it move? Is it stuck in one place? Those are the kinds of things that I had to look at with my dog, because I can't clearly ask her all the things that I would like to ask to be able to find out the questions to narrow down. Is this like a blood stasis thing? Is this a phlegm stasis thing? Is that like, what exactly am I dealing with? Is this a hot phlegm or cold phlegm? And those are terms in Chinese medicine. I keep forgetting that. I know I have quite a few acupuncturists that listen to this, but there's also lots of other people who aren't. So I apologize if I'm getting a little too jargony. This stuff is just really exciting to me. So learning what kind of cancer you're dealing with is extremely important, because how it responds to different herbs is going to change dramatically. All right, so now let's talk about fasting and cancer, or specifically fasting as a adjunctive therapy for chemo. There's a lot of good science about fasting and cancer, and if you do a total review, you'll find mixed results for the effects of fasting in cancer. But recently, that has been accounted for to some degree. It turns out that if you control all of those reviews for making sure that they hit a 48-hour period of fasting, all of the conflicting results disappear. Now, with fasting, it takes about 48 hours to get to the place where your body starts ramping up its innate anti-cancer properties. So it makes perfect sense to me that it takes a minimum of 48 hours for the benefits of fasting to really show up as a protective effect for chemo. So it's super important to fast your loved one or pet going into chemotherapy for a few reasons. One, as mentioned before, cancer cells need glucose in order to grow and do their cancery things. So fasting reduces the amount of nutrition available to cells. Cancer cells are very different because they have mutated in a way that allows them to grow nonstop. All the built-in firewall protections have failed to prevent exponential growth. So when your pet is infused with the toxic chemo drugs, only the cancer cells are actively dividing, and of course, unfortunately, bone marrow. But the fasting makes that much less. So since they're demanding all of the nutrition, they are taking up all of the chemo drugs in their gluttony of, I want to do what I want to do as much as I want to do it. Because that's my cancer voice. The healthy, non-mutated cells, however, during the time of fasting are relatively safe. There is an evolutionarily conserved protective process for surviving famine that all healthy animal cells have that cancer cells just don't. During times of famine or fast, they close down their doors to the nutritionally scarce extracellular matrix, and instead, they focus their efforts on healing and cleaning. Cells are programmed this way in order to survive instead of replicating due to the lack of resources. This is twofold fabulous because it not only sensitizes mutated cancer cells to uptake more of the chemo drug, but it also is chemoprotective for the healthy cells, preventing them from being injured by the chemo during the famine. It is worth repeating, it's crucial to hit that 48-hour mark. You have to hit that 48-hour mark at least once during your rolling fasts in order to get the benefits of the fasting. For Key, I fed her a normal-sized meal at 3 p.m. the day before her chemo appointment. Her appointment was at 3 as well, which put her at the 28-hour fasting mark at the time of the chemo infusion. I figured that was plenty of time to start telling all of the cells in the body it's time to close those doors. This was intended to make the 48-hour fast as painless as possible too, because she didn't have to like get the chemo and like do all of these things and have to like start the process all over again. And we needed her fasting for some labs and stuff, so it worked out well. It was hopefully enough time that her metabolism had started to note the deficiency of food and slow down the replication of cells everywhere else in her body. So ketogenic diets and intermittent fasting are wonderful adjunctive therapies for cancer due to the same mechanisms that I just covered. Not having a constant supply of food in your blood and body forces the healthy cells to adapt to an environment, allowing you to adapt better to your environments, as well as eliminating the plethora of food available for cancer cells, as cancer cells don't seem to be able to use ketones. So again, conserving an adaptive process innate in the body that not only is profoundly helpful for weight loss and health, is also fantastic for maintaining the adaptive processes for the future when or if, God forbid, you or somebody that you love gets cancer. For the record, I made one big mistake during this process. I waited a week before I started chemo in order to hopefully find the right kind of chemo. We weren't sure what kind of chemo, and I was reading a lot about how ineffective the wrong kind can be, basically. And I wasn't sure how the process worked. And so I was going, okay, which do we think is better? What's better, early treatment or the right treatment? And I waited a week, and in that week, the tumor got dramatically larger. And in that time, it got large enough that it started obstructing Key's good nostril. She's had one nostril that's been clogged for almost 2 months now. And that was how we originally found out that something was going wrong, is she was bleeding out of that nose. And it was just bizarre. Well, the first time I found out something wrong, before she was bleeding out her nose, she wound up just hacking up a big old pile of blood on my floor. And I was like, what the hell? But I made one big mistake that I'm aware of so far. I wish I would have started chemo earlier. I mentioned it's really important to know what kind of cancer you have when you're trying to research herbs and figure out what it is that you're going to be able to give and do for your loved pet. But in this case, early treatment, I think, early treatment trumps like the correct treatment, because I thought it was kind of a one and done thing. I thought like once you started it, like you got chemo, I thought we got it a one and done, but turned out the one and done was supposed to be the blood transfusion, because, well, I mean, they don't want people just giving their animals blood transfusions every 2 weeks to try to just keep them alive. That's cruel. So they mentioned that it was kind of one and done thing, and I thought they were talking about the chemo as well. But they weren't. So I waited too long and the tumor grew. And had I done it a week earlier, it was still growing fast and it probably wouldn't have been as big, and I wouldn't be worrying every night about positioning Key's head just right so she can breathe, because she's only got the one nostril. So if she lays on the side of her good nostril, then she winds up waking up hypoxic and like kind of gasping for air and going. It's not a fun thing to wake up to. She doesn't like waking up to it, and I don't like waking up to her waking up to it. So I wish I would have done that. That was my biggest mistake. And like, this process has been extremely difficult to go through. I've tried my best to make good decisions. Unfortunately, there is no right or wrong decision. Like, that's not where we're at. You have to just make the best decision that you can make at the time. But I do believe I got this decision wrong, and now I have to live with that. I have to live with the fact that my desire for the right or perfect treatment absolutely caused Key's like extra however long to be less comfortable because her nose is more clogged. Now, since then, it's shrunk a little bit, so I feel less bad, and I feel like it wasn't as bad of a mistake because the tumor is still shrinking. I'm still giving her some anti-tumor stuff. I'm focusing currently on dissolving phlegm. I used a bunch of clear heat relief toxicity herbs when the mass was dark red and black and growing rapidly, and that turned it from black and growing rapidly to looking like regular healthy flesh, but it got harder. And so since then, I've been focusing on dissolving the phlegm, and it has shrunk the tumor, which has made it easier for her to breathe, but it's still an issue that I wish I would have handled a week earlier. But I didn't. And so now that's just a thing that I have to deal with. I wonder about other decisions, like getting her x-ray to see if it had metastasized to her lungs. A chest x-ray has a bunch of radiation, but I mean, usually it takes a buildup of a bunch of radiation in order for it to have a negative side effect. But it was right after that radiation that because we thought there was a tumor in her nose and there wasn't one in her mouth when I first brought her to the vet. And it was after the radiation that the tumor in her mouth showed up. It started showing up around one of her teeth. And that was really unfortunate, and I've wondered if maybe the chest x-ray had something to do with that. But I mean, that's grasping at straws. I wanted to know how far along the cancer was. I wanted to know if it had metastasized. They took a lymph node sample to check for metastasis. And had I known at the time that they could do that too and just do a lymph node sample to check for metastasis instead of a chest x-ray, granted, the chest x-ray tells me if it's metastasized to the lungs and the lymph node tells me if it's metastasized to the lymph node, but we were really just trying to stage the cancer at this point. So, yeah, there's so much involved in all of this, and that's why I wanted to do a podcast on it, and I know it's a long one, so I appreciate you sticking with me. So, since I've talked about ketogenic diets and intermittent fasting, I'm just going to hit food macros for a dog. A ketogenic diet for a dog should consist of like almost 80% fat. That's what it says. I don't give Key 80% fat. I don't count percentages that much. I do, however, make sure that when I give her herbs, I give her herbs in tallow or lard. Tallow first because it was a better quality, but then when I ran out of tallow and I couldn't find it anymore, I had to buy lard, and that was fine. But then I switched off of the lard because she didn't seem to do as well or like that as much, and I just started giving her the herbs in cheese, and she likes cheese, so that works. But it's really important that they do get lots and lots of fat, especially if you're running like a keto all the time thing, because the ketones come from fats. They don't come from the proteins. So your dog needs lots of protein and all of that, but your dog needs lots and lots and lots of fats because those ketones come from fats. And your dog, in my case, my dog, is working really hard to run all the processes of its body in ketosis, which is basically a starvation state, and it works. But it is difficult. So make sure that you give them ample fats and ample varieties of foods. So let's dive into the Chinese medicine stuff. Let's look at how Chinese medicine views cancer. So Chinese medicine has 4 etiologies, and it's treated by one of these 6 strategies, usually multiple of these 6 strategies. And depending on what symptoms you see, you choose one of these strategies. So the most important one, as I mentioned earlier, is supporting the patient, supporting their constitution. That's the very first one here. That's the one based on Zhenjiang. That's all about supporting the vital energy of the person so they can fight the cancer themselves. So there are 6 strategies to Chinese medicine and its treatment of cancer. And they can be like, one deals with anxiety, phlegm, and waste. One's anti-tumor and immunity. One's kind of oxidative stress. And one is helping to establish normal, healthy blood vessels, right? The role of Chinese medicine is different at each stage of the treatment of cancer. TCM plays a supporting role during radio and chemotherapy, because radiotherapy and chemotherapy can damage the qi in blood, the essences and the fluids, and the function of the 5 viscera and bowels, 6 bowels. The most common side effects are fatigue and alopecia, like loss of hair, vomiting, and white blood cell decline. Herbs are really good at preventing all of those things. The fasting can be good at helping to prevent a lot of those things. There's a therapeutic function for herbs in advanced cancer patients too. For advanced cancer patients, elderly patients, or for those that are just too weak for whatever reason for radio and chemotherapy, TCM is marvelous because it has very few bad reactions and can stabilize tumor lesions, improve symptoms, enhance quality of life, and prolong survival times. I have here a site for a study with 304 patients with stage 3 and 4 adenocarcinoma lung cancers. They had marvelous outcomes. TCM has a great role to play in post-operative cancer patients. It fits so well. I mean, in a way, it feels now like Western medicine is the perfect adjunct for TCM when it comes to cancer. I know that sounds really backwards, but it really feels that way because TCM has everything and Western medicine has one thing. So how the fuck is TCM gonna be the adjunct? Like, Western medicine does one thing and one thing well, and it does what America does well. It attacks, burns, obliterates, destroys, and makes money on it. That's what it does. Chinese medicine can help you at every stage from 0 to 4 of the cancer process. And Western medicine can really help in like 2 of those, well, really 1.5 of those stages, like stage 3 and stage 4, as long as you're not too weak. And it's really just not helpful because it's so aggressive for weak people. If you treat everybody with a basis of Chinese medicine, then you use chemo and radiation as an adjunctive therapy to target real hard those tumor cells, and you never give up on supporting the patient's digestive functions and supporting the patient's qi and blood functions, you'll have a much, much better chance of success. So I've talked a lot today. I've covered a lot, and I know that this was kind of meandery. I hope that this turns out good because I'm tired of starting this podcast over and re-recording it. So I'm just going to edit it and hope that you guys get what I mean. I told you that the format for all of this changed. And as you can see, this episode is considerably longer than my previous episodes because I try to cover a lot, and I try to cover it without any like science and too many detailed information, too much detailed information. So for those people who are interested in the more detailed information, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 19. I have 19 pages of notes that I took for this podcast that I'm staring at right now. And I have a folder of, Lord, I'm not going to count all those. I have a folder full of sites, sites with a C. And that cover all the stuff that I've looked at. For people who love this podcast and are interested in supporting it, I'm going to post all of my notes as well as every single study that I found and used in my research over the last month that I touched on barely any of, it feels, today. I will post all of those on the Speak Plainly podcast Patreon. Yeah, say that 3 times fast. The Speak Plainly podcast Patreon. I finally started a Patreon for this because it has officially started to get expensive, having to pay for all of the software and the uploading fees and all of that sort of stuff. So if you want the notes that I took from this and you want access to all of the science that I found, I will be posting that on the Patreon for exclusive Patreon members. There are 2 tiers that you can choose from. Choose whatever you like. That's all explained there. I hope that you got something out of this. I hope that it was informative for you, and I hope that you learned some new stuff about the treatment of cancer using herbs. I hope, it was my desire that people learn all of the benefits that TCM has to offer in the treatment of cancer. And I also hope that people who maybe have that bad taste left in their mouth over Western medicine and chemotherapy and all of that for good reasons. I will be doing another podcast on the origins of the medical system in America, where I will talk more about the origins of the medical system and how quality cancer interventions have been suppressed by the American Medical Association and the government, but that's a whole nother podcast. So I would like people who do maybe have that bad taste in their mouth to also recognize that Western medicine is powerful. And at certain phases of treating cancer, I think you're a bit freaking foolish if you don't use Western medicine. It's good for very little. It's good for very little. But what it's good for, it's irreplaceable for. So use it for what it's meant for. And I think if used in conjunction with Chinese medicine, that's the best possible outcome for everybody involved. If you have any concerns, find an acupuncturist, find an integrative oncologist, find an osteopath doctor, find an osteopath oncologist. Find somebody who specializes in using a integrative approach to the treatment and management of cancer. It is a terrible disease that hurts far too many people. And we can do better. We can. There's a big gap. And I'm doing my best to stand in the middle and branch from one side to the other. I think Chinese medicine has a lot to offer when it comes to the treatment of cancer. I think Western medicine has a lot to offer when it comes to the treatment of cancer. I didn't even get into some of the really cool stuff. I didn't even get into the fact that in China they're doing injections now of formulas of ginseng compounds and of other formulas. They do mistletoe injections and they have really great results from that. There's all kinds of cool stuff. And now there's immunomodulated therapies where they're able to modulate T cells and macrophages to go in and attack just the specific type of cancer cells. Now, I mean, it's amazing. Some of the changes that we've seen in the last, even just 20 years have been incredible. incredible on the treatment of cancer, but those advancements have been in very narrow areas. Still, very exciting information. I'm happy to share it. I hope that you enjoyed this and that you learned something. You have a marvelous, marvelous day. If you want to support me on the Patreon, you can go ahead and find that. I'll put a link in the description. If you've made it this long, thanks for hanging out. And remember, stay blessed and stay uncomfortable.